There's such a connection between spirituality and wisdom. If you look historically at it, I mean, if we talk about the Bible, there's over 222 references of wisdom in the Bible. It doesn't matter what religion are, whatever their main text is, there's references to wisdom. So I just changed things a little bit and really talk about wisdom, but I'm really talking about spirituality.
But what stories or practices or effective practices might you talk about how leaders can bring their core spiritual dimensions, regardless of what the source or anchor or practice related to those dimensions is, but for bringing those dimensions into their leadership?
Take a look at what the values you learned in whatever spiritual/religious organization you grew up in. Big question you ask yourself is, are you exhibiting and demonstrating those values?
Welcome to the Spirituality in Leadership podcast. I'm Andrew Cohn. Spirituality in Leadership is a platform for conversations with leaders at all levels about bringing our spiritual dimensions to our leadership, our teams, our workplaces, and all areas of our lives in order to achieve greater success and fulfillment and build and sustain healthier organizations. If you'd like to connect with me to talk further about these topics and or about individual or team coaching, leadership workshops, or team alignment, please go to my website, lighthouseteams.com. Enjoy the podcast. Welcome back to the Spirituality and Leadership podcast. I'm Andrew Cohn, and in this conversation, I speak with Greg Stebbins. Greg has been in this space of the intersection of spirituality and leadership for quite a while. He's really an elder in the space, as you can tell, pretty much straight away. And he's just has a lot of wisdom, basic wisdom to share that's so helpful. And I'm struck by the impact of some of the basic things he's talking about that are just so important. He talks a bit about his own story and a background in a military family. He talks about inner wisdom, how the wisdom development is never ending. And he actually later on talks about an evolution of leadership to what he calls transcendent leadership, which is based upon reflection to develop wisdom. The three components of one's leadership identity he discusses, and really, maybe most importantly, I think, he talks about the importance of self-inquiry and self-reflection, knowing who you are and where you're coming from. Lot of experience and wisdom in this conversation with Greg Stebbins. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Spirituality and Leadership podcast. I'm very pleased to have my friend and colleague Greg Stebbins on with us today from Green Bay, Wisconsin, a mere 1,400 miles away from where I am or so, probably a whole different ecosystem. But welcome, Greg.
Yeah, Green Bay is kind of like moving back into a 1955 Norman Rockwell painting.
Mm-hmm. Well, better than Mad Men, but yes, good. And Greg, as far as from my point of view, Greg was one of the real pioneers in the connection between spirituality and business and leadership. He has had his own practice in coaching and consulting for more than a few years, since the last millennium, as I sometimes like to explain it in terms of my own practice. And he has put to use his MBA and doctorate in education into his practice. And you may talk more, Greg, about some of your education and how that's come to shape some of your views. But we've talked a bit about this topic. You and I met as you were involved in the formation of the Transcendent Leadership Master's Program at the Peace Theological Seminary and College of Philosophy in LA. I was about to say you're native LA. Is that where you're from or just where you were educated?
Actually, let me give you a little background about that, because it's kind of interesting. I grew up in a military family. My dad was a West Point grad, was in the Air Force. So we never lived in one place more than 3 years when I was growing up. Shortest was probably 6 months. And the family tradition has been West Point, his brother, my grandfather, and going back to the early 1800s with family. There's some interesting sidebar conversations about that. I got involved in really thinking about spirituality and wanting to be involved in some sort of group when I was at University of Miami. And that was in the late 60s, early 70s. But the beginning of that quest was actually from my mother, who I like to refer to as Swami Mommy.
Nice.
My brother and I couldn't get away with crap. I mean, she knew. How she knew, I don't know. I mean, it's like, and even when I had moved out to LA to be more directly involved, I get a call ever so often. Okay, what's going on? Nothing, Mom. Don't lie to me. Tell me what's going on. There's no way to hide it from her. She just knew what was going on. So when I was about 16, she used to buy me Jean Dixon books. At that time, Jean Dixon was a very prominent psychic. And she would just hand me the book and say, yeah, I think you may find this interesting. And that was it. Of course, I just absorbed it, and that was really the genesis that caused me to want to look for a more direct spiritual group to be involved in. So I've been involved with the spiritual group I'm involved with since 1970.
Wow, but so interesting. So your mom, Swami Mommy, military family, longstanding generational military involvement, and yet she's picking up these books and sharing them with you to help you, presumably, along with, checking in on you. She hands you these books to help keep you on the right path, maybe would be an expression that she would use.
That would actually be a very good description of what she was hoping to do, given my propensity for attracting trouble. But the funny sidebar is, in the middle of my junior year, I decided to drop out of University of Miami and move out to California. And so I went home Christmas and told my folks that I would be jumping in my car in January and driving out. Using a military analogy, is not like rolling a hand grenade across the floor.
Okay.
So my dad said, finish out your junior year and I'll pay for you to go out to California. He used to, when he didn't want to do something, he'd look at me and say, I'll take it under advisement.
Okay.
And that's what I told him, I'll take it under advisement. So on January 20th, I jumped in my car and drove out to LA. And then education was on my path. So I went ahead and finished my bachelor's degree out there and my master's degree and the doctorates from Pepperdine School of Education and Psychology. I actually wrote a psychology dissertation, which is what allowed me to become a member of the American Psychological Association. So I look at things from both a spiritual perspective and a psychological perspective, which is very helpful when I work with leaders.
And typically, and what's been, if you could quickly, not that this needs to be our focus, but talk a little bit about your professional path and how it's led you to where you are now, and some of the things that are connecting to what we talk about here on this podcast.
Well, it's interesting because I've always had a natural inclination for sales. When my dad was stationed in Denver, I went to summer camp that had 2 water fountains on 20 acres of land. And I convinced my mom to buy me a little plastic canteen so I could carry water around with me. So then the bigger kids started coming up and pestering me for water. And I'd say, okay, a nickel a swallow. And they would, of course, drain the canteen and then hand me the nickel. I didn't care because my fixed costs were nothing.
Right.
And so that went on for a couple of days. And then the third day, the camp counselor came to me and confiscated my canteen. And when my mom came, he looked at her and said, don't ever let him bring this back in. What he's doing is bad and wrong. The only thing I hadn't figured out was how packaging and distribution. Because we all buy bottled water now. So I was just early part of it. And I did a lot of selling when I was in school. And so my first real commercial sales job was when I started doing commercial real estate in the late 70s. And I did that probably till about 85. And I wanted to get into the consulting business. And I joined a couple of guys doing consulting. They were doing seminars and I learned how to do that. And then about 1990, I formed my own company because I wanted to do things differently. And so that's really when I started doing leadership development and bringing forward the spiritual stuff in terms of leadership development. There's such a connection between spirituality and wisdom. If you look historically at it, I mean, if we talk about the Bible, there's over 222 references of wisdom in the Bible. And then it doesn't matter what religion are, whatever their main text is, there's references to wisdom. So I just changed things a little bit and really talk about wisdom, but I'm really talking about spirituality. So, what I'm doing is talking about inner wisdom, which is the same thing as, coming from your spirit. That's been going on since 1990.
Wow. Wonderful. And so I'm curious to know how, there's so many questions I'd like to ask you, but one place to start might be, how have you seen things change in terms of a receptivity for these kinds of conversations, particularly in business? I'm actually assuming that you're primarily focusing on business. Is that accurate? Or are you in
Yes.
nonprofit or education?
Yeah, primarily business. Well, in the late 1990s, Judy Neal, who you have talked to, and I think you've interviewed her, put on a series of programs, Spirit in Business. And it started to take off. And then what happened was, in a lot of corporations, people went religious. So what my religion says, and the senior executives started going, nah, we're not going to do that. And there was a big drop off. So probably 2002 through about 2006, 2008. But now it's starting to come back in vogue again. And I have people like Jim Collins, who's the author of Good to Great. A quote of his is, you can't go through your life working in a business you don't love with people you don't love. So there's a very big voice in business talking about loving leadership, which leads us into spiritual leadership. So it's come back full circle, and it's started to pick up steam. So, your podcast is right on target.
Great, thank you, and thanks for being with us. So, what stories or examples? I hate to say best practices because I always think best practices are limiting. But what stories or practices or effective practices might you talk about how leaders can bring their core spiritual dimensions, regardless of what the source or anchor or practice related to those dimensions is, but for bringing those dimensions into their leadership in an inclusive and effective, productive, holistic way?
Yeah, I think Stephen Covey said it the best and said, you're talking about universal concepts. You're talking about coming from compassion, coming from empathy. And if you can't swallow the word loving, you're coming from positive, unconditional positive regard, like Carl Rogers talks about. So those are three of the big things. And then take a look at what the values you learned in whatever spiritual / religious organization you grew up in. The big question you ask yourself is, are you exhibiting and demonstrating those values? And a lot of people find out that, yeah, they got the words right, but their actions are very different. And with Generation Z now coming into leadership roles, there's a very low tolerance for people who do not exhibit what they talk about. In fact, there's a huge disconnect. They just say, no, I think I'll go work somewhere else.
Because of the incongruity, or you're not practicing what you preach, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And they're very adamant about that, which is nice to see, because people in my generation, Generation X, and some in Generation Y, were kind of like, yeah, I'll put up with it because my real life is outside of the business. But Generation Z seems to want to have a holistic kind of environment, so that what they do at work and what they do in their personal life, there's no difference. So they want to know what the purpose of the organization is. And they want to know that the people are working for the greatest good, or as I like to say, the highest good. And there's a lot of corporations that still run and command and control. And you work for me, I pay you a salary, and that's the only relationship we have. But that's beginning to fade out. People who do transformational leadership are looking at their leaders to be the kind of people who get them enthused. So charismatic leaders. And if you move into transcendent leadership, is really, are you leading from the core of who you are? Are you leading from that presence? Do you carry that presence with you? Or is it just a facade that happens to come in a room with you at the same time? So that's probably the biggest thing.
Well, let's talk about the biggest thing. And I'd love to connect the biggest thing with something that is sort of the hypothesis of this podcast about these core spiritual dimensions. So tell me about the relationship as you see it, and I'm sure you have a clear point of view about this, between these core spiritual dimensions on the one hand and demonstrating real presence and authenticity in leadership. How do those two connect in your experience?
Well, the easiest thing to say is, from my perspective, everybody is spiritual. They may not know it, though, because they haven't taken any effort to uncover that part of themselves. But I operate from a point of view that everybody is spiritual. And my job is not to teach them to be spiritual, but help them uncover that. And the three biggest ways to uncover it actually came from St. Ignatius in the 1500s, when he wrote a book on spiritual exercises. And they were prayer, meditation, and contemplation. And those are the three biggest things I do today on a regular basis. And I've been meditating probably for 55 years, about 2 hours a day on average. Some days not so much, some days a lot more.
And what does that? This isn't rhetorical. I would love this to be very practical. What does that do for you, and for others whom you touch?
Yeah, my experience when I talk to people who do that kind of work for themselves, they have a clarity of thinking, clarity of making decisions, clarity in emotions, and clarity in imagination. So those four things make a huge difference in how a person leads, because you need to have a clear imagination for developing a vision statement. Some leaders I've met don't even know what to get for lunch. It's a vision for their organization.
Right.
With the advent of emotional intelligence about 15, 20 years ago, people are much more versed in what they need to do to get a handle on their emotions. So I would say there's not as much, not that there isn't any emotional blowups within organizations, because people still hit that rough patch. And that's just a sign that they haven't done the internal work. So when we talk about wisdom, the old expression was experience gives wisdom. So everybody thought, okay, I get old age, I'll have wisdom. The only problem is it's really the learning you have from the experiences. Because there's some people who have the same experience at 20 and they have it again at 70 and 50, and you just track back, they never get past that experience. They never get the learning that's available to them. So that's a lot of what I do when I work with an executive, is help them get that experience and say, what's the learning from that experience? And usually when you do it that way, you can slide in sideways and bypass all of the defense mechanisms. Not that any of us have those.
Oh no, of course not. I've heard about it though. But yes, but the way you're framing that is, it's not sliding by in some sort of end around or manipulative way. It's a very practical way to. It sounds like what you're doing is you're sort of bypassing the philosophy and getting to a very practical. What are you distilling the learning from that experience?
Absolutely. And I say, okay, what's the experience? The challenge that most people have is we all have perceptions about, or perspectives about what the world is. Some of those are perceptions, some of those are projections that come off of our unconscious. If you listen to some psychologists, they will tell you that all perceptions are projections. So when I talk with a person, they'll say, well, here's my perspective on that. I say, okay, how much of it's perception, how much of it's projection? At first blush, they always say there's no projection here.
Oh no, because we're not aware of typically what that lens is clouding.
Right. So then I spend time talking to them about, have you ever done something and realized that you're either creating, promoting, or allowing that situation to happen? And then they go, yeah. I said, is it possible that might be true here? And when they stop and really start looking at themselves, the problem is, if you try to go directly into the unconscious, you'll understand why it's called that, because you'll go unconscious. You'll fall asleep. However, that's where contemplation comes in, where you really hold with that and just say, okay, what is this? What is it really here? So whether it's a thought or emotion or imagination, you just hold with it and say, what's here? And then whatever it is reveals itself to you. Now, for a lot of executives, that sounds like gobbledygook. But when I work with them to practice it, oh my God, I've been doing this since I was 6 years old. So yeah, it was probably imprinted in you by your parents or your friends' parents or whatever religious institution you're involved in, whatever school system you're involved in. I mean, I've been at it for a long time, but I still uncover stuff that I go, oh, Christ, that's where that came from. So it's a classic never-ending story. And that's the thing about wisdom. There is no end to it. It's just a very, very deep pool. And I would say the same thing about bringing your spirit fully on in a business environment. It's never ending. It's a very deep pool. There's more and more you can learn about yourself. And then if we do learn interpersonal skills, what we would call outer wisdom, you learn more and more and more about people, and you realize they have a very different view of the world than perhaps you do. And that's why listening is so important, because you want to understand that view they have of the world, because otherwise you're not going to be effective communicating with them. So that's the second piece of it. Is like, and that's why our company's called People Savvy, because that was where we started. And then I started bringing in what I've been learning over the last 45, 50 years, more and more into what I do.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Before I lose this thread, something you mentioned about prayer, meditation, and contemplation. So prayer, I think we all have a pretty clear sense of what that is. That's between me and something higher, something divine, something like that. Could you just briefly talk about your definition between the distinction between contemplation and meditation, and how you talk about those two, please? Meditation
is, the way I do it, is a very active format. Mm-hmm. Some of it is tonal meditation, some of it is what's referred to as a yantra or visual meditation. But it's a very active part of you. Contemplation is much more reserved and is focused on, let's see what this reveals to me.
So it's reflective that way, it sounds. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And prayer, from my perspective, is a one-to-one conversation.
Mm-hmm.
What I refer to as a divine source or divine presence. Mm-hmm. Some people like to call it the source. Some people refer to it as God. So, it just all depends on the culture the person was raised in, what they're comfortable referring to or not. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing about our leadership identity comes from our beliefs, our values, and our attitudes. And those things shape our leadership behavior. Most leaders are not familiar with all the elements of those three things: beliefs, values, and attitudes.
For themselves, you mean?
For themselves, mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So beliefs requires going back to when all that was imprinted in you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And values, some people have really taken the time to understand what they value and what they don't value. Mm-hmm. The challenge is how you define values. I'll give you an example. I was working with this one business person that had been approached by another business person in town about combining their business. And I said, well, it'd be good to ask him what his values are. So values sit in a hierarchy. You're more willing to sacrifice lower level values to keep your upper level values intact.
Sure. I've heard it called some values are subjugated to others.
Yes, same thing. Mm-hmm. So as he worked with this guy and he got to the top two, his personal values were integrity, then making money. The guy he was working with had them reversed: making money and then integrity. And I said, here's what's going to happen. A deal's going to show up that's going to cause you to go, no way would I ever do that. And he's go, what are you, nuts? Look how much money we're going to make. And that's where the relationship will fall apart. He entered into the relationship and they combined businesses and it was going great. And then a deal showed up where they just had to shade the truth a little bit. And he was aghast. Mm-hmm. And his partner was like, what's wrong with you? Look at the money we're going to make. Mm-hmm. And split, went different ways. So knowing what your values are is critical because it's going to shape the kind of organization that you're leading. How do people relate to that organization? From the values, purpose is going to flow. And if you're unclear about the values, the purpose is going to be unclear. So people are not going to know what to hook their wagon to.
Which makes followership very difficult.
Yeah. difficult would be a nice way of phrasing it.
Difficult at best. Yeah.
Probably impossible. But the problem is if you're wrapped up in your ego of what's going to go on, you won't see it. And so a lot of spirituality and wisdom is realizing what's ego-driven and what's self-driven. And I'm speaking self with a capital S, not small self.
Okay, and define what that means for you, please.
Capital S is your authentic self. Some people call it your soul. Some people call it your Atman. Whatever language, whatever religion you're brought up in. It's your presence, but more divine presence than just showing up. I mean, you go out on the internet today, you can find workshop after workshop on how to develop out of fake presence until you make it. The problem is you can't fake real presence. Person walks in a room and everybody goes, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing. And you haven't even said a word yet, because who you are broadcasts out and is received by all those people who are open to receiving it. And so when you walk in with your divine presence and you're coming from compassion, empathy, and loving, people go, I don't care what we're doing here. I just want to be part of it.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you're saying that, because for me, that can often be, and again, when you're talking about self, that's the way I would describe that sort of core dimension, what I might call universal dimensions of human beings, universal all around the world. We all share that, but it's below that physical, emotional, mental levels, and it's what's that core level. But I appreciate you're saying that it's recognizable, but it's not necessarily the same as charismatic leadership, because somebody could walk in with a great sense of empathy and compassion and loving and presence, and it's not, hey, follow me. It's more like, I can hold space for this group. It's not necessarily, I'm particularly interested in leading you all up the mountain.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people have been led up the mountain, and when things get tough, the leader disappears.
Right.
And then you're up in the mountain going, what the hell do we do now?
Yeah.
So,
right. Well, to your point, and that earlier point about the difficulties of followership, if someone's not congruent or clear. And again, as you said earlier, I think that the workplace now is so much more interested, is really demanding. I need to know that you can hold space for me. That's what I hear and see from my clients. And I'm very fortunate because I coach senior level leaders. I also coach MBA students. And my MBA students, like I hear from them who they're looking for, and they have choices. I mean, coming out of Wharton, for example, the people I work with, they have choices, and they can smell bullshit a mile away.
Yep.
And it's not, they could be smarter than their person they're going to go work for. They're okay with that. But they could still learn from them, and they can still follow them.
There's an interesting merger happening between emerging leaders and experienced leaders. Both parties learn from each other. It's almost like the emerging leaders come in hardwired for all this stuff. It's like Generation X and the millennials came in hardwired to operate computers. They just knew how to do it.
Right.
The early Generation X, and somebody says, my VCR still goes 12.
Right.
You have a 9-year-old in the house? They go, yeah, ask him.
Right.
Exactly,
and now it's like, well, of course, and now it's like, what's a VCR? Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
So they have to be careful. Well, and perhaps they're so conversant and fluid with it because they weren't raised to be, or they didn't learn to be afraid of it.
Yeah.
That's what I find. It's like the younger generation just isn't afraid of erasing everything.
And this generation is not afraid of crossing the line that other generations had as a wall. They want the kind of stuff that you're talking about, that I work with the senior executives on. And I work with a lot of emerging leaders as well, because they're hungry for this kind of thing. So how do we do this? And the trick is, you got to listen to yourself. You got to be very, very much in touch with yourself. And I'm talking about the big S. And you got to know when you're coming from an ego. The thing is, a lot of people have it wired up that you should have no ego. Well, if you had no ego, you'd sit and lay in bed all day in a fetal position. You'd never get anything done. So having an ego is not a negative thing. parading the ego as a form of dominance, like in command and control cultures, that is devastating to people. But that's where we came from.
If I can ask you a personal question, and I'm not sure why this is coming up for me, but I want to follow it. But when you say command and control, military is about as command and control as you can get. And that's from whence you came. So I wonder, did you ever circle back with Swami Mommy and your dad about what you do and what's important to you and what your priorities are? And how did they respond to that, if you did?
Well, with my mom, yeah, but my mom has passed. My dad passed in 1990. His comment to me was, "I don't buy what you're into, but I say that with no rancor." I said, "Okay," but what you asked the question about, West Point today teaches classes in transformational leadership. They don't teach transcendent leadership yet, but it's a big jump, and there, a lot of people consider West Point to be the preeminent leadership school in the United States. It's certainly in the top 5, because that's what they teach them. So,
well, and one of my other podcast guests has a very strong Christian faith and who comes from a military background. And she was a psychologist in the Army in various locations around the US and in Germany. She said the Army has a very long history of theism. There have been chaplains in foxholes for a very long time. They're not shy about talking about religion. I'm in no position to evaluate how well they do or they don't, but they're not shy about talking about it. It can be a welcome and helpful conversation.
Yeah, but it goes beyond that, Andrew. Because it really talks about the person getting in touch with themselves. And that's what the military academies, all of them, in fact, have had as a subtext, but now it's more open and more direct from my experience in just reading the curriculum. One of the advantages of having my father as a West Point grad is my wife and I went back to their reunions every year. And so I got a chance to talk with a lot of the guys. I graduated in 45. Not everybody made it out because some of them went to Europe and some of them went to Japan. So there's a lot of people. In fact, the guy who wrote the book about Vietnam experiences, We Were Soldiers. There's a Mel Brooks movie made of that. He's a dear friend of my father. They both passed, of course, but I remember driving up to his house when we lived in Denver, and he was in Kansas, and we'd hang out with the family. So, that was the kind of experiences that I had. And, when you grow up in that environment and you're in a movie theater, a civilian movie theater, and you stand up for the first time, waiting for the Pledge of Allegiance to come on, and then you look around and no one else is standing up, there's things you got to adjust to.
Well, and I appreciate, I just feel like I want to just, give a shout out and honor your dad for being open-minded as he was, notwithstanding his strong indoctrination. I don't mean indoctrination as a judgment. I mean indoctrination as indoctrination. That's what he grew up with. And yet he could acknowledge what you were doing and saying, okay, I'm not buying it, but I can respect it, is what I'm hearing.
Well, he was a very unusual man. I'll give some more background on that. When I was 19, I filed for conscience objector. That was in the height of the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, my dad was flying munitions over to Vietnam and bodies back. It wasn't a whole lot of fun for him. My sister told me there were some very loud conversations that came from my parents' bedroom. Of course, I was at college and I didn't know anything about that. And he talked to me one time about global military theory and then never said another thing about it. He actually was more upset with my brother, who was 4F because he had asthma as a kid. And he thought my brother used it as a cop-out, but because I made a conscious decision to not do that, he respected it.
So right, he respected that challenging position that you took.
Yeah. But still, when I said I'm going to go study with my guru, that really was rolling the hand grenade across the floor.
Yeah, more loud conversations, right, coming from the bedroom. Yeah. Yeah. Nice.
So I guess the important thing here is what are you doing, or what is the leader doing to understand more about the core pieces of themselves, which is really where we get into in terms of spirituality or wisdom, depending on what word you want to use. And that is looking at all your experiences and saying, what did I learn from that? What did I learn from that? What did I learn from that? And you'll find out that there's a lot that you learned and there's more that you could learn. So, but going through the process requires self-inquiry, just asking yourself about the experiences. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders don't do self-inquiry. They do self-inquisition.
Yes.
Themselves up, right? It's like, I shouldn't have done that. And then the next step is self-reflection. And that's really where you start to go very, very deep into it. And then go into really understanding the core thing to understand what your intuitive insights are. And the intuitive insights are when you really begin to contemplate what the reality of that is. What caused me to have that experience? Sometimes you'll never get to the root of that. But if you begin to chip away at it and just hold it and let it reveal itself to you, it becomes more and more evident. And then you'll eventually have what I refer to as a wisdom moment. Sometimes that's referred to as the aha moment. So, oh my God, and you start bunching all of those aha moments together. That's really the precursor that takes you into transcendent leadership. So transcendent leadership as a methodology is bounded by wisdom development on the front end and continued wisdom development on the rear. Because wisdom development has no end.
Which in turn relies upon taking the time and taking the energy to do that sort of active reflection, which in my experience is one of the biggest battles for leaders. It's taking the time. I'm not sure what my values are. Let me take an assessment, 15 minutes online, and it'll tell me what my values are. And I can do that. And I've done that with leaders. But of course, that's the beginning of the conversation, not the end of the conversation, because we don't need more, mouse pads flying with values statements flying over people's heads like Frisbees. We need conversations about them. And I think from what you're sharing, which is my experience as well, is that especially in an increasingly younger workforce, there's an appetite for this, if not an expectation, that we need to be out with our values.
There's another piece that you have to be very careful with, and that's the whole 360-degree surveys. Because the comments a person makes about another person is a perception or is a projection. And you won't know until you have, like you say, you have a conversation with a person. The problem is, typically in a lot of organizations, you don't poke your head up above the horizon. So I'll give you an example. I was doing a program in South Africa, and we had a 360 instrument that people were using. And usually if you scored high on one part of the instrument, you'd score low on the other part of the instrument, because they're mutually exclusive. So a couple of the people who were co-facilitating with me came to me and said, how come it's perfect five all the way around? I said, no, that's easy. The person said, hey, I want you to fill this out and just give me all fives. And if you have a job that's allowing you to eat, much less live, what are you going to do? So we had a number of leaders in there that had perfect fives all the way around. And is it probable? No. Is it possible? Yeah, maybe possible, but probably not probable. So,
right. Yeah.
At that point, when I worked with a leader through wisdom development, and I don't do a 360 assessment. And I said, have you ever gotten a 360 assessment where you knew who did it because that's what they do? And he said, yeah. I said, yeah, so you don't know how much that assessment is projection. And that's the hard part. You got to wade through all the projection. I worked with a guy a long time ago that was his modus operandi. I did no wrong, but I'm going to project what I did onto you. And fortunately, I was big enough just to handle it because he could not handle it. So he had to project on somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
life in a
Yeah.
family.
Yeah, well, and I consider myself fortunate because for a lot of my clients, I do qualitative 360s and I talk to a lot of people and a lot of stakeholders. And I can't say that I can always detect when people are hiding or concealing or framing, but I'd like to think that I often can. And it's you could just get better information that way. And especially feedback in people's own language, not necessarily in the language of the assessment, which I think is helpful. But yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, we talk about the value of feedback, but if the feedback isn't good, it ain't much value.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
We get useful feedback. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, I'd say based on what I know about you, you probably pick up the bullshit about 99% of the time. And it's just 1% that he's, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But let's explore this for a second. What do you think?
Right.
And then we're into a conversation with the person.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they uncover themselves when you're in conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as I like to say, these conversations, I just had one this morning with a CEO of a mid-sized business and speaking with somebody on his staff. And as I like to say about this should not, what we're talking about here should not be confidential. Anonymous perhaps, but not confidential. So what do you really want this person to know? That will make everybody's life easier. And we start framing things that way. In any case, I digress a little bit from our thesis.
I actually no, you're right on target with your comments because as a person becomes more self-aware, which is a critical part of spiritual development in leadership, you got to know who you are and where you're coming from, and realize also that not everybody's coming from the same place. So here's an example of that. I was working with an executive team, and the CEO wanted to change directions of the company. Everybody in the company, VP of marketing, VP of sales, VP of human resources, were all in alignment. The CFO was not in alignment. He thought it was ridiculous. So I had a private conversation with the CEO, and I said, if you don't get him into alignment, you're going to need to make a change. He goes, Greg, I can't. This guy's a lifelong friend. I said, oh, he may be a lifelong friend, but he's going to destroy the company. So what we worked out was the CEO took it upon himself to help find this guy a new job where he'd be in alignment with the purpose of the organization. Today, they're still friends. He got a CFO that was in alignment with where they want to go, and the company is taken off. So that would be another piece of bringing your spirituality to work, making sure everybody's in alignment, and that's having a clear purpose, what the company's about, where they're going.
Well, being very clear about that. And also what I'm hearing is, correct me if I'm wrong, but also respectful of other people's values and purpose to see if they are aligned. It's a choice. He didn't throw a rope around all these people and said, we're coming. You were all aware enough about whether somebody was aligned and on board or not, and respected that. It doesn't mean that everybody gets their way necessarily. There is a leader, there is an organization moving in a certain direction, but there's a respect for where somebody is, not shaming them for not being on board with a shift.
Yeah, if a person's not in alignment, it just means they have a different agenda than you need to go fulfill. It's not necessarily, I don't like your agenda and your it's just I have a different agenda. So help me find a place where I can put the agenda into effect. And he did that. He kept his friendship.
Nice and beautiful, and cared for his company and cared for the friendship. Yeah.
And what was more important, him doing that, the other members of the executive team were not in the dark about it. They saw that. They saw what the leader was doing. And they went, yeah, I can follow this guy. I feel like I'm part of a team. So that fulfilled a significant purpose for those people. Because the battles that go on for people who want the CEO role and end up siloing the organization so they get the glory, that just destroys organizations.
Well, you talk about different people's agendas, and I appreciate your agenda. and your voice in this space. I would refer people to many of your articles on Forbes. Is it Forbes.com? Is that the way to get them?
Yeah.
They could search by your name, or Transcendent Leadership, or Transformational Leadership, but certainly under Greg Stebbins on the Forbes website, they'll see some of your writings there. And if people want to contact you or want to learn more about your work, what's the best way to do that?
Call me.
Okay, just call you. All right, call
Yeah.
you.
You want the phone number?
You tell me. You could do a phone number. You could do a website. You could do a LinkedIn. You tell me. How would you like people to know?
310-433-5020. I like personal conversations. I do a lot of stuff online. I do a lot of online coaching and stuff. But I need to have that personal contact with the person before we begin.
Perfect. Sounds very aligned. And that says something about your values as well.
Yep.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Andrew.
And sharing your experience. I didn't realize there were skyscrapers like that in Green Bay, but apparently there are behind you.
That's the only false thing on this video, is the background. Right. And no, right, well, they're not skyscrapers in Green Bay like this.
Fair enough. Great.
Maybe the one off to the side here is, but not the big one behind me.
Right. Great, Greg. Thank you so much. Appreciate sharing your wisdom and experience. And I'm sure I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in some form or another.
Great. Thanks a lot. You take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Spirituality in Leadership. If you want to access this wealth of knowledge and insight on a regular basis, please subscribe to the show. Join the network of leaders who want to do and be better. You can go to the site spiritualityinleadership.com or your preferred podcast platform to catch all the episodes and learn more. Until next time, take good care of yourself.